Well, good morning, everyone. It's right about 9 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and start up this PowerBrew. So welcome to all of you. My name's Jill Hermes. I'm the Director of Corporate Solutions with Advantage C, which is a service of Carroll Community College. And I'll be your facilitator today, along with Michelle Shepard, our Client Support Services Coordinator. And if you've joined us before, you know how this rolls out. But if you're new, we'll give you a brief introduction. So Advantage C is the portion of the college that works with our business community here in Carroll County. We provide training in a variety of areas, really, leadership and management, emerging technologies, safety. We provide help with consulting, facilitation, and assessment. Our goal is simply to help this county continue to thrive economically. So we look forward to working with you. We encourage you to check out our website. The nice thing is that if you ever miss a PowerBrew, or if you love a PowerBrew and you want to tell your colleagues and friends about it, we do have them archived on our website so you can access them at a later date. So Michelle's going to tell you a little bit about the logistics for today.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So a lot of you have joined us in the past for these, so this is basically just going over what you already know. So that red arrow at the top, it's actually a little orange, will control or expand, will expand or collapse the control panel so you can see more or less of the presentation. So if you've joined a webinar with Mike before, he really likes these to be interactive and engaging, so we welcome all the questions that you have. I know his presentation today does have a few questions he might be asking the audience. So right there at the bottom right of your screen, you'll see a question panel that you can go ahead and type in.
Thank you. So let me tell you a little bit about Mike Mannion. He is an adjunct faculty member here at Carroll Community College, and many of you have probably been lucky enough to attend a class that he has facilitated and taught. He's high energy, he's always got a great message, and he has a gift at customizing the content to the group's needs. So Mike has invested his work life in helping professionals really be the best they can be. Early in his career, he taught Dale Carnegie training. He's conducted national training for Oracle and Marriott. He led 2 CEO organizations in the Mid-Atlantic, Vistage and Convene. He's currently a partner with Vantage, a company that, among other things, runs the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Leadership Academy and also the Navy SEALs on briefing and communication skills. That's pretty serious and significant stuff right there. He also leads Marcus, a company that helps leaders achieve victory in a variety of very difficult situations. And I will say that Mike can definitely claim to be experienced in facing difficult situations well. Mike and his family, his wife Heidi, raised their family here in Westminster. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Mike, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Jill. I was standing in my kitchen. This was about 2 years ago, standing in my kitchen, having this epic meltdown. My wife, Heidi, was at Johns Hopkins Hospital with our son, Zach, and that was not uncommon. In fact, as of today, in the last almost 3 years, Zach has been inpatient for almost 200 days. So the fact that she was away at the hospital with Zach was not unusual. But he was about to have surgery the following day, one of what would become 8 surgeries that Zach has had. What was also going on inside of me was I had a huge work deadline and deliverable the very next day. It wasn't a class that I was teaching, but it was a piece of a communications plan that we were working on for a very important customer and very demanding customer, and I had an enormous amount yet to complete, and it was due by the end of the day. And what's more, there were some of my 7 other kids at home in the other room fighting and yelling and screaming, and it was his fault and her fault. And this confluence of events was just too much for me to handle in that moment. And I don't think that I have ever in my life felt more despair and powerlessness than I did in that moment. And I remember saying out loud to myself, we're going down. And in that moment, I had this aha, and we've all had them, where something that we've heard maybe hundreds of times in our life, and we didn't really pay much attention to it. We knew it was true, but it didn't really hit home for us. I realized, I had this aha moment that one of those sort of slogans, if you will, was absolutely true. And it was this: I had to win the battle of my mind. And if I didn't win the battle of my mind, I was going down, my work was going down, my family was going down. It was all about to be destroyed if I couldn't win the battle of my mind. And so what that prompted me to do was eventually, a few weeks later, get a book called The Obstacle is the Way. And that was my introduction to Stoicism. And so that's why we're here. We're going to spend a little under an hour talking about the intersection of two things. One of those things is the difficulty or complexity or hardship or change or disruption that you're currently in the midst of in your life, and particularly your work life. But these principles apply equally to work and home. But the intersection of that type of complexity and hardship and challenge with some fundamental principles of Stoicism and how they can help you. So here's what's in it for you. Oop, and my clicker is not working. If we can get my clicker to work, that would be great. All right, here's what's in it for you today. Let's go back. You'll help your team thrive in high stress environments. Very specifically, you will be able to be more effective, more powerful, exert greater agency in your high stress, high performance environments. Another way to say it is, despite the hardship, you'll be able to advance your mission. So that's, again, what's in it for you. At 10 o'clock, when we're done, you'll be better able to advance your mission in the midst of hardship. That's what's in it for you. So let's talk at a very high level of about our agenda and how we're going to get there. First thing we'll do, we'll spend a tiny little bit of time defining Stoicism, what it is, what it isn't. We'll spend most of our time looking at some basic Stoic tools, and most importantly, how to apply them at work. And so just as a bit of an aside, what we're not going to do is cover everything in Stoicism. I don't know everything in Stoicism. I'm only 2 years in, but I do know what has worked for me, what have been absolute game changers for me. And so we're going to look at mainly those principles or those tools in Stoicism that have made an unbelievable difference in my life, work and home. And most importantly, how to apply those at work. We'll spend most of our time doing that. Throughout the webinar, if you have questions, by all means, type them in, and we'll see if we can't address and answer the question right then on the spot. We also have some time at the end to answer questions and talk about your specific situations. And then at the very end, there are some resources that I will suggest you avail yourself of to learn more about Stoicism. But again, the reason we're here and the what's in it for you is for you to be able to advance your mission in the midst of hardship. So with that, let's get started. And again, there it is, what's in it for you. So let me talk about what Stoicism is not. There are a lot of common misconceptions about Stoicism. It is a philosophy, considered a philosophy. It is not an existential philosophy, meaning it doesn't answer the questions, what's the meaning of life? What is love? What is my purpose in the world? It doesn't seek to answer those questions. Nor is it this emotionless, stone-faced, stiff upper lip, regardless of how bad it gets, I will not crack. I will not complain. I've done my fair share of complaining. It is not that. So what is it? Here's what it is. It is a philosophy that is focused on the everyday leadership challenges that people face. And the big three Stoics, if you will, historically are Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca. So let's talk about how Stoicism got started. I think that'll shed some light on how practical and helpful it might be to you as leaders. So Marcus Aurelius, if you've seen the movie Gladiator, you know that he is or was a real person. He was a Roman emperor, and he was considered one of the three greatest Roman emperors. And what he was in the habit of doing was journaling. So at the end of the day, getting off the battlefield, getting out of a meeting governing Rome, getting out of a conversation or family event with his family, he'd keep a journal about what worked and what didn't work. And it was an opportunity to delve into the mind and the thoughts of one of the most powerful people in the world, if you were to be able to read this journal. Well, after his death, some years after his death, somebody found his journals, and they eventually put them into a book called Meditations. And so Meditations is essentially the founding or the start of Stoicism. And again, Meditations, it's a book you can buy, it's a book you can get in the library. There are different translations, some a little bit easier to read than others. But it is the private thoughts and the self-review of one of the most powerful people on the planet who was a leader facing on-the-ground leadership issues. So again, that's what Stoicism is. It's a set of tools and principles that help leaders deal with real-life leadership challenges that they face every day. Let me tell you what Stoicism is for me. So that's a picture of my son, Zach. Zach is what Johns Hopkins calls a medically fragile child. He's almost 3 years old. As I've said, he's spent much of his 3 years inpatient in the hospital. Whenever he goes inpatient, my wife Heidi is there the entire time with him, which leaves me at home with our 7 other kids at home to not only try to provide them with a stable life, but also, of course, I work and I've got all these other responsibilities just like you do. Zach's coded 3 times. He's had 8 surgeries. And when he is home, he is on full-time PICU level care. And if he were not to get that care, he would die. So that's the level of complexity that was introduced into our life, in addition to all of the other complexities that we all have in our lives. And so what Stoicism is for me is an operating system, and you can see it on the slide there. It's an operating system for seeing, thinking about, and responding to difficult events, circumstances, and people. So let me just rephrase that, or let me restate that. It's not, let me tell you what it is. It's not this bag of tools. It's not this bag of tricks. It's not a set of strategies. I mean, I guess it is those things in some way, but it's far more deeper for me. It's an operating system. It's a way of looking at, thinking about, and responding to difficulty that I face. Difficulty in terms of events, circumstances, and people. So let's drill down on that just a little bit and talk about what do you mean by operating system. So when I was having my meltdown in the kitchen and realized that I needed to win the battle of my mind, I didn't know it at the time, but I was actually practicing Stoicism. I was practicing one of the fundamental ideas in Stoicism, and that is there is an event, and then there is the story we tell ourselves about the event. So we're going to get to a little more about that in a moment, but these are some of the stories I was telling myself. These were this was the data in my operating system. I don't deserve this. Why me? Why did this have to happen to me? Why do we have this incredibly complex medical child? As much as I love him, I would never give him back. That's not my point, obviously. But we already have 3 other kids with CF, cystic fibrosis, which is a uncurable genetic disorder. It's terminal. And wow, now we've got this. Why me? Or I started blaming God. Why did you do this to me? This is your fault. Or things were just fine before. You can see the common stories that many of us tell. I told every single one of these stories again and again and again in my mind. And that was my operating system. So anytime something came up, another disruption, greater complexity, this is where I would go, and this was the operating system from which I made decisions. Clearly not a good operating system. So when I started to read the book, The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday, I discovered that one of the first principles of Stoicism is, well, we're not going to get to that. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. What I realized was I needed to destroy those ideas. So I don't know if you recognize the man here. His name is Charlie Munger. Charlie Munger is the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway. He has been Warren Buffett's right-hand man for probably 30 some years. Warren Buffett is the chairman of Berkshire Hathaway. Warren Buffett is one of the wealthiest men on the planet. He's considered the greatest investor in the last 100 years. And he credits his success to Charlie Munger. Charlie Munger credits his success to a particular operating system, a mental operating system that he's used. And so we're going to look at some of what Charlie Munger uses as his operating system in a moment. But the very first thing I realized I needed to do was something Charlie Munger calls idea destruction. And some of you may have heard this concept before, where at times, in order to really learn something, we have to unlearn something first, whether it be bad habits or misinformation. It's a similar concept. And so what I realized I had to do, I had to destroy those ideas. I had to stop feeling like I didn't deserve it, or it was a question of deserving. I think you get the point. So one of the basic tools in Stoicism is this idea of idea destruction. And in fact, it's been my experience that this really has to come early in the process. So to put it another way, whatever hardship you're dealing with right now, whatever complexity you're dealing with, whatever the change or disruption has been, there are likely some stories you are telling yourself about it that are not useful to you. They're not correct, nor are they useful. And before you can move on to a better place, to a less stressful place, to a more effective and productive place, you have to destroy those ideas first. That's what I had to do, and I have found with other people that has to come early, this tool of idea destruction. So my question for you is, and it would be great if a few of you would be willing to type in the answer to that first question. What is the change that you're going through right now? What's changed for you? What's the disruption that is currently taking place in your life? So once you land on that, the question we don't have time for in this webinar, but the question that I would encourage you to really think deeply about is there a story that you're telling yourself about that event that is either not true, not necessarily true, and or it's not helpful? So just another example, one of the stories I told myself early on was, well, this means that we will never be able to take the kind of family vacations that I've always dreamed of. Another story I told myself is, I will never have the opportunity to focus on my work and give it the really deep attention it deserves, like I'd always planned to and like I had before. So those were two stories that I had about the event of Zach coming into our life. And those had to be destroyed because they were not true. I have found them not to be true, nor were they useful. So I'm not sure, do we have anyone who's typed in anything? So that's fine. My encouragement to you, again, is to start here and to think about the event or circumstances you're in and think to yourself, what's the story I'm telling myself about it? That is not helpful. So before we move on, it's important for me to say this. What we're not talking about are positive thoughts necessarily, or that superficially. We're not talking about positive thinking or looking on the bright side. In fact, what Viktor Frankl discovered as being a POW during the Second World War is that the people who fared most poorly in terms of POWs were the people who were, he called optimists. These were the people who said, well, I think we're going to get out by Christmas, or I think we're going to get out by Easter, or we're going to get out by the summer. These were people who would look at things optimistically, always on the bright side. And in fact, James Stockdale, who was one of the most highly decorated military personnel in Vietnam, found the exact same thing to be true. He was 7 years a POW in the Hanoi Hilton, much of that time in solitary confinement. And in fact, he was a Stoic. And what he found was that the optimists were the people who fared poorly. It was difficult for them to hang on to their sanity, and it was certainly difficult for them to be effective in the POW camp. Any of you who are Special Forces, Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, or if you have a family member or know someone, you may already know this, that they will tell you the same thing, that it's the realists who tell themselves stories about what's really happening and tell themselves stories about their own actions and behaviors rather than outcomes. These are the people who handle their stress best. These are people who handle the hardship best. These are the people who are most effective in those situations. So again, this is not about positivity thinking. This is about what mental models, if you will, do I use to look at the world, especially hardship, and do I need to change my mental models? So Michelle's giving me the sort of nod there. What does that mean, Michelle?
So we did have a few people write in while you were just talking there. So I'll just read a couple of them.
Okay,
one person typed in that they would love to expand their business, but they realized that they need time to spend with their family as well, that they just can't do it all. And then we have somebody else that says that, her knee pain is preventing her from exercising. So those were a few of the responses we had.
Yeah, so what I'm not going to do is give some pat answers to these situations because I don't think there are any pat answers. What I would suggest very gently to you is that there are some exercises that I'm guessing you can do with your knee pain. And I say that not to dismiss your knee pain, but what I have found is when I have felt like I was in a corner with no place to go, I always had a move, that I had enough agency, so to speak, that I could always do something. So I'm not suggesting it's going to be easy. I'm not suggesting that I know what it is. But what I am suggesting from my experience is you will always have a move, even if you can't see it right now. And I would suggest something similar to the person who typed in, I'm trying to grow a business and I don't want to shortchange my family. I'm not walking in your shoes, so I don't know what that looks like or feels like in your specific situation, but I totally get that because that's exactly what I've been doing for the last almost 3 years, is growing a business, as well as having incredibly complex, demanding family responsibilities. And what I can tell you is it's not ever neat. It's not ever really, tidy and put together. It gets a little messy oftentimes. However, as we progress through the webinar, we'll land on those things that are most important. And I think what you will find is that you will be able to do the things that are most important to making both of those goals happen. And Stoicism can help you do that. So you don't have to do it all. You just have to do a few of the most important things. I know that sounds kind of superficial. On the surface, maybe it is. But there's some deeper truths there that we'll unpack as we move forward. So thank you very much for typing those in. I appreciate that. So this is where we're at right now. One of the fundamental tools of Stoicism is recognizing, you might want to call it perception, that we have this power of perception, and that there is a very clear difference between the event and the story we tell ourselves about the event. And so we have a choice to make. I always have now a choice to make. I stop myself and I say, what story am I telling? And then I say to myself, Is there a better story I should tell? Or should I tell myself no story at all? And when it comes to telling a better story, it's not the optimist positivity outcomes-based story, like, well, maybe things will just get better, or maybe things will go back to the way they'll always be, or maybe Zach will come home in 2 days. I hardly ever think like that anymore. But what I do think about, or stories I tell, are things like, this is an opportunity for me to be far more organized with my work than I was ever before. Or it's an opportunity for me to cut out some of the chaff in my work and focus more on the real drivers that make me successful and my largest contributions to the companies that I do work with. Or it's an opportunity for me to really understand deeply, or more deeply than I did before, what it's like to be vulnerable in this world. So again, the difference is I'm telling myself stories about actions I can take rather than outcomes. So that's where we're at right now. Let's go back to Charlie Munger for a moment. Charlie Munger, if you know anything about Charlie Munger, you'll know that he is really a huge proponent of mental models. So you heard me say that Warren Buffett credits his success to Charlie Munger. Charlie Munger credits his success to what he calls mental models. And these are ways of just looking at the world. They're thinking tools, and they guide our perception of events, and they also guide our behavior. So let me give you some examples of mental models we're all very familiar with. If you are a chemist or a physicist, both of which I am not, nor will I ever be, but we've all heard of the law of thermodynamics. It's a mental model. It describes how energy behaves in a closed system. So if you're a physicist and you're trying to solve a really hard problem, one of the filters you're going to look through is you're going to say, well, energy is never created or destroyed, and therefore you're going to use that to help you solve the problem. Another mental model that many more of us are more familiar with is the law of diminishing returns, that we can work on something for a period of time, and there comes a point where we're not producing nearly as much, or we're not getting as much benefit out of it. So those are mental models. I'm going to share with you several mental models that have been very helpful to me as it relates to change. So there are mental models that apply to lots of different areas of life. These are a handful that I have used to reprogram my operating system and help me look at change and disruption and hardship differently. So the first of which is, we've probably all heard it said, people hate change. Okay, well, actually, that is not true. And in fact, brain research and neurochemical research proves that people do not hate change. In fact, what they prove is that not only are we neurologically wired for change, but we actually love change, with a caveat. So when people say they hate change, it's usually because of two reasons. It's whatever's changed is not something they would have chosen themselves. It's not as good or beneficial to them. Even more importantly than that is how the change went down. So let me give you an example. I've worked with several companies in the last several years that have been acquired by other companies. And so for many of the people in the acquisition, this was not a change that they were looking forward to. It's not a change that they would have ever picked for themselves. What I have found was that what was more difficult for them to deal with was not the fact that the situation had changed. It was how the change went down. So for instance, if any of you have ever been through an acquisition where you have been a part of the acquired company, you'll know that information and communication is really important to you. And oftentimes the information is incomplete, and sometimes it's even flat out wrong. And so what happens is you feel powerless, and that causes tremendous stress. And so the people who handle being acquired most effectively are those people who have been informed and feel like they have some level of control over the situation. So let's broaden this just a little bit. If you're on this webinar and you're a leader who is is bringing about change. You're one of the change agents in your organization. You already know, I'm sure, that it's important how the change gets communicated and how the change goes down. I think the very specific thing to take from this slide is that there is a stress sweet spot that we all have. And if you can give the people for whom the change is impacting a greater sense of control, you'll find that they can actually thrive in the midst of this change, even if they wouldn't have picked what the change is. So again, the learning from this is there is a stress sweet spot. And in fact, neurologically, serotonin gets released from the brain when things are changing, but the change is not so drastic. When something changes, even if we don't instigate the change, it's instigated on us, so to speak, by someone else. If we can give people an appropriate level of control over themselves and their environment in the midst of that change, they actually feel a sense of well-being because serotonin is secreted. So one of the mental models that has helped me is the people that in my world that have had to change because I've had to change, they can actually love it if I lead them through the change most effectively. So that's one of the new mental models that's in my operating system. Here's another mental model that's been very important to me. This is a gentleman named Jonathan Fields. He's a serial entrepreneur. And one of his mental models is what he calls the organizational life cycle. And what you'll see there are three states. When an organization is small and it has not overextended itself, he calls that simple grace. Things are working well. There's not a lot of moving parts. They have adequate resources, whether it's funding, whether it's manpower, whether it's technological infrastructure. Things work well. It works for everybody. It works for customers. It works for the company or the organization. Private sector, public sector, families, makes no difference. Simple grace is a really nice place to be. Let's say you aspire for something bigger, though. So on one extreme of the spectrum, you have simple grace. The other extreme would be what Jonathan calls sustainable complexity, where you have lots and lots of moving parts. Company or organization is much bigger. You're serving far more people, and you're able to do that sustainably because you have sufficient manpower, you have sufficient funding, you have sufficient policies and procedures. You get the point. Where many organizations live, though, is in what he calls the unfortunate middle, where you have aspirations to be bigger, and you are in fact bigger. The company is growing. You've gone from maybe 50 million a few years ago to 200 million now. You have aspirations to double that in a few years, and you're experiencing what are called growing pains. And the growing pains are because you're in the unfortunate middle. My family's gone through that. We were set up, for instance, to work somewhat effectively with 3 kids who were visiting Johns Hopkins routinely. We now have a son who practically lives there, and we've spent way too much time in the unfortunate middle. So the mental model is there are these 3 phases, and as a leader or a manager, it's our job to either move back into simple grace or focus on building the infrastructure and resources to move to sustainable complexity. You don't have to live in the unfortunate middle, but we oftentimes do. So again, that's a way of looking at the world. And once I realized, my gosh, my family's stuck in the unfortunate middle, or some of the companies that I've worked with, they're stuck in the unfortunate middle, I was able to figure out how to move out of the middle. So that's another mental model as it relates to change. Here's another mental model as it relates to change. And this was developed by a gentleman named J. Stuart Ablon. He runs the Think Kids, I guess it's called the Think Kids Academy at Mass General Hospital. He has spent his life working with people, not just kids, but kids, professionals, incarcerated individuals who have what most of us would call challenging behaviors. And so let me give you an example of what I'm talking about that I know some of you on this webinar deal with. You are an employer, either private sector or public sector, that has hard to fill entry-level positions. It's hard to fill these positions because people typically don't want to take these jobs. They're very tough jobs, kind of physically, not kind of physically demanding, sometimes dirty jobs, so to speak, and people don't want to take them. And it's hard. So when you find people who do take them, they often bring some baggage and some challenging behavior with them. That's just the reality of it. And so what I have heard managers and supervisors say, and I've agreed with it, I thought it was right, was these people don't have the same desire or will to work hard or to be a professional like I do. And what J. Stuart Ablon has discovered through his years of research is that while, yes, there are some outliers who do not have the will to change, the main reason people don't change is not because they don't have the will, they don't have the skill. And if you look at that quote there at the bottom of the screen, that quote, when I read that, it absolutely blew me away, because I know it's true of me, I know it's true of my family, I know it's true of the people I work with, that we all have operating systems. We all have these skills we've developed to handle what work throws at us, to handle what life throws at us. We're doing the best we can. I mean, for the most part, we're all doing the best we can. But if we have some lousy skills, we're not going to produce the kind of results that we want, or other people certainly want or expect out of us. And so what some organizations are starting to do is they're starting to look at, through the interview process, what people's ACE scores are. So not getting too far down the rabbit trail here, but for those of you in the helping profession who are on the webinar, I know you're familiar with an ACE score. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so what this means is, have you had a parent incarcerated? Have you been abused? Have you lived in poverty, et cetera? So there are 10 questions, and stating the obvious, the higher your ACE score is, the more challenging the behavior will be as you bring it into adulthood. Another way of saying that is, that higher your ACE score is, the less skills you will have that you bring to the workplace. So what some employers are doing, who employ people in difficult to fill entry-level positions, is they're looking at their ACE scores, and they're then shoring up with training, and in some cases counseling, the skills that these people lack. And the early returns, this is almost brand new, it's not brand new, but people have been doing this for about a year now. They're seeing some very promising results. They're seeing far less people shaking out of the system, far less people quitting their jobs, far less behavior issues, and more productivity. So again, that's a mental model that I now look at the world through, especially because I do training, and it's skill, not will. I'm going to give you one more, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but I think it's important as a culture creator in an organization. I don't know if anybody knows what that is. I know it's a smartphone, but if you look at the bottom, there's a clue there. That is an Amazon Fire. That was a flop. Amazon spent some money on that. It did not take off. In fact, the last CNET ratings for the Kindle Fire, I think it got 3.5 out of 10. Not very good, and so it didn't catch on. And the thing about it is, Amazon, on some level, couldn't care less. And in fact, what Jeff Bezos said was, and there's his quote, "We learned a lot from the fire, and we're going to use those lessons in the future." What Jeff Bezos ascribes to is a mental model called being risk averse, but not loss averse. And so I thought to myself, well, what's the difference? I mean, aren't those the same things? And actually, they're not. What he would like people to do is to not fear making mistakes, to not fear suffering some losses, as long as the losses are not so big that they'll ruin you. And so Amazon obviously has enough money to suffer quite a few losses on failed products, and they make their bets in such a way that if any one of the bets goes bad, it's not going to ruin the company. And so the lesson here from a mental model point of view and a culture building point of view, as it relates to change and hardship, is don't be afraid to allow your people to make mistakes. Create the kind of culture that, as long as lessons are learned from mistakes, and mistakes are certainly going to be made in the midst of hardship and complexity and change, just don't create a culture where risk-taking is one of your fundamental cultural values. Just create a culture where loss is okay as long as the risk is not outsized. So let's kind of reset where we're at. Where we're at is one of the fundamental principles of Stoicism is to understand there's an event and there's a story we tell ourselves about the event, and that becomes our operating system. It's a way that we look at and respond to, in this case, hardship, complexity, change, disruption. And if we're ever going to be less stressed and more effective in that type of hardship, we need a new operating system. I needed a new operating system. And so mental models are a way to create a new operating system for yourself. But we can't do that until we destroy the old ideas. So if you're interested in learning more about mental models, I would strongly suggest you get on the Farnham Street blog and just type in mental models. You can Google mental models, Charlie Munger. This is one of the top things that'll pop up to learn more about that. So one of the fundamental principles of Stoicism is perception, the event, the story we tell ourselves about the event. Let's go on to the next one. This is almost as important as the story versus the event, and it's control. So if we were to look at this just very superficially or at a high level, I'm just going to tell you something you already know. I'm not going to end there, but that's where we're going to start. So what's up to you and what's not up to you? What do you have within your control and what do you have outside of your control? And so the suggestion is, of course, to invest your time and energy and actions and behaviors, your money, whatever, in things that you can control or at least mainly control. And of course, starve what you can't control. So let's state something else that's rather obvious, but we have to state it because it's the starting point to this conversation about control. What's up to us and what isn't up to us? Well, what's up to us, what we have control over, of course, to some degree, are our emotions, our attitudes, the way we perceive things, the decisions we make, the actions we take. That's the playing field. That's where we should be focusing our energy. Everything else we do not have control over. We don't have control over other people. Okay, so up to this point, you probably haven't heard anything that you don't already know. Here's where the ahas came for me. The issue of control is the main point when it comes to control is this. When we're going through change, when we're going through disruption, hardship, complexity, much of our life, much of our work life is already outside of our control. And so what we must do to keep our sanity, to keep our focus, to be productive, is we must control the things we can, the things we should. Okay, so what I'm not saying is, yes, it would be nice and our life will be better if we do control those things. What I'm saying is this. In order for us to be effective, we must control the things we can and should, because there are so many things outside of our control that we can't. And when we fall into trouble is when we don't attend to either of the extremes. So one of the extremes is there are things that are under my control and I have not controlled them. That is incredibly stress producing. What's also incredibly stress producing to the point of addicting is when we try to control the things we can't and shouldn't. So let me give you an obvious example of the things that we can and shouldn't control. When we micromanage people in the workplace, we shouldn't do that. That's not to suggest that some people don't need more attention and more hand-holding. That's not my point. The point is, micromanaging is a horrible thing to do, not just for the obvious reasons, because it's annoying, it's not as productive, but what it does is it takes away a person's sense of power and agency. So I'm going to look at some notes here because there's a whole day I could talk about this, but I want to make sure I capture the most important things. So the most debilitating part to me of change and disruption is the feeling of helplessness that I get sometimes, the feeling that I have no agency or power over my own life. And when addictions happen, and when I say addictions, I'm not just talking about substance abuse, I'm talking about any sort of addictive, compulsive, non-productive behaviors that are numbing mechanisms because we sense we don't have control. So let me state that a different way. There's someone I just talked to recently. They told me that they're a supervisor in a manufacturing plant. And one of their people frequently kind of goes offline, not figuratively, but off the production line. And they're texting on their phone, they're looking up things on the internet, they're checking scores on ESPN. And so not only is that, for obvious reasons, a bad behavior, but when you peel that back, it's an addictive, compulsive behavior. Most of the time, most people do that because it's a numbing mechanism, because they're trying to control things that they can't, or they're not controlling the things that they can. So what can we control? I will suggest to you that there are 3 things that you must control for you to be able to handle the stress and the pressure and to be effective with the things you can't. So 3 things that we can control. We can control our routine, for instance. So you may have heard of this YouTube video about making your bed. There is a retired Navy admiral or somebody who gave this commencement address. And the whole point was, make your bed and make your bed. And what he said was, because no matter how bad your day is, when you come home, you'll see your bed made and you'll say, well, at least I got that done. What's going on here below the surface is, if you go through your entire day, and so much of it is outside of your control, that's incredibly stressful. You know that. What eventually happens is, for some people, they acquire what's called learned helplessness. They feel like, well, I don't have any control over this, so I'm not going to exercise control over that. Another way to think about that is the broken window effect. So if you're familiar with that, it's a sociological mental model, which says if you drive into a neighborhood and there's a broken window, if the window doesn't get fixed by a certain period of time, the likelihood of a second window being broken goes way up. And then if those don't get fixed, then the likelihood of graffiti goes way up. And so it's similar here. There's this broken window effect that if we don't control what we can, then the next day we're not going to control something else we can, because we are learning to be helpless. And so what's going on when you come home after a day that was largely out of your control and you see your bed made is you realize, I do have control over some things in my life. I do have agency. So the issue here, that the fundamental issue here with control, is not just control what you can and stop trying to control the things you can't because it's annoying or it's stressful. It's an issue of personal agency. So for instance, in the helping profession, some of you, if not many of you, are familiar with what's called trauma-informed care. This is an approach to counseling, and it's an approach to providing social services, where your process for doing that takes into account that there are people who have severe trauma in their life, and therefore they don't have certain skills that others may. And one of the most fundamental principles of trauma-informed care is to give people choices and to exercise control as often as possible. So that's different than saying, what would you like to do here, and giving them 50 choices. That's not the point. The point is, through the process of counseling or providing social services, at different junctures, can you give someone a choice? Can you give them a sense of control? So what this is really about is personal agency. And the more personal agency we can exercise when everything else around us is out of our control, the less stressed we'll be and the more effective we will be. So the question is there something that you're expending energy on that's outside of your control? Another question perhaps to talk about with your team at work is there something that you're responsible for? You have to report on to your boss or to the executives, the executive team. And some of the drivers of that deliverable, they're outside your control. Can you reconfigure the work process so more of it's under your control? And if some of it isn't under your control, can you get those people to the table as well? So control is, again, one of the fundamental principles of Stoicism. Let's look at one more. We're going to look at more than one more, but let's dig into one more. So that, of course, is Tom Brady, and he is a stellar example of staying in the moment and doing only what is next. Now, for those of you Tom Brady haters, just so that you don't log off, I have given you a slide, all right, and that's Tom Brady getting pummeled in the Super Bowl. All right, so, and I figured if you hated Tom Brady, you probably hated Bill Belichick. So in the lower right-hand corner, there's a picture of Belichick contemplating the loss while the Eagles celebrate. So that's for you, you Patriot haters. Okay, now let's get back to Tom Brady. I'm not a Tom Brady lover. I think they cheated, whatever. But what Tom Brady is exceptional at, what he has been trained to do, is only what is next. In fact, and I hate to use a lot of sports analogies, so this is probably the only one I'll use, but when they won the game, the Super Bowl against the Falcons, and they were way, way down, they had just gone down 28-3, and he's trotting out onto the field for the drive. And it was very telling to me where his mind was. And you can read these quotes on some Sports Illustrated article. He said he wasn't thinking about the score, wasn't thinking about the defense, wasn't thinking about the alignment, wasn't thinking about the personnel package. He wasn't thinking about any of those things. The only thing he was thinking about, and I quote Tom Brady, we need a clean handoff. So I know this sounds rather obvious, stay in the moment. It's not that easy to do, but it is essential to controlling one's stress and to being more effective. So let's look at some ways to do that. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Ivy Lee. Ivy Lee was a consultant in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And one day, Charles Schwab gave Ivy Lee a call. So not the Charles Schwab that many of us think of, the Charles Schwab investment person. This was the Charles Schwab who was running Carnegie Steel for Andrew Carnegie in the late 1800s. He eventually bought Carnegie Steel from Carnegie. He eventually bought Bethlehem Steel. So he was one of the wealthiest, most powerful business people in the entire world. And he was looking to increase the productivity of his Bethlehem Steel plants. So he gives this guy, Ivy Lee, a call, and he says, come on in, I'd like to potentially use you as a consultant. So they meet, and Ivy Lee says, this is my plan. Give me 15 minutes with each of your top executives. And so Charles Schwab says, well, okay, how much is it going to cost me? It's not going to cost you anything right now. In 3 months, get back to me, and if you're happy with the results, you pay me what you think it's worth. Left it completely open-ended. At the end of 3 months, Charles Schwab called Ivy Lee, brought him into his office, cut him a check for $25,000. Now, this was 1920 something, I think. In today's dollars, that's slightly over $459,000. And what Ivy Lee suggested to these executives they do is for the next day, so not to do this in the morning of the day of, but to do it late afternoon or evening of the next day, was to write down these 6 priorities. And then when they showed up the next day, to work only on number 1 until it was completed. And so many, many, many companies use the Ivy Lee method to stay in the moment on the most important priorities, and I do the same thing. So some of you may be rightly saying right now, whoa, hold on a second. That's not really the way my business works. I mean, I've got like this, for example, a manufacturing company. Let's use manufacturing. That's a great example. I'm a line supervisor. I can't just show up and say, well, this is what's most important to me today. We're not going to do anything else, because you're responsible for throughput. That line's got to keep moving, and it's got to keep moving with the quality that you need to ship to the next station or to ship out the door. And so if you don't have the opportunity to reconfigure your daily schedule to work only on the most important things, my suggestion is you do this. And this is what many manufacturing companies, or any kind of company that has a set process, they're very process driven in that regard, is you think about, okay, so I can't really use the Ivy Lee method when it comes to the things that I do to work in the business, but I can use the Ivy Lee method to work on things that I work on the business. So for instance, let's say that one of my priorities in working on the business is training my team on a certain new skill that would be important to make throughput better. So that's what I would focus on. I'd still do the day-to-day in the weeds, get the throughput, get the process moving. But in that period of time when I had a little opportunity to step back and work on the business, I would continue to work on that top priority until it was done. So there are ways to use the Ivy Lee method, even if you have a business that has a very set process that you are very hands-on in. I'll give you one more example of how to stay in the moment, and this is something that is hugely effective and necessary for me. That gentleman on the cover of Forbes, his name is Paul Graham. He's the founder and CEO of Y Combinator. This is an incubator started back in the 90s in Silicon Valley, and he has funded and helped start up any number of successful companies. He's a Silicon Valley rock star. And he came up with this idea of manager time and maker time. So I'm going to give you an example in my own life that will illustrate this for you. So I do work, obviously, here at the college, and one of the people I work with is Michelle. She's sitting right over there. Michelle is a manager, meaning most, if I understand your job correctly, certainly as it relates to me, most of your time working with me is spent organizing my activities and making decisions. Is that a fair statement? Yeah, okay. Most of my time, as it relates to the college, is what we call maker time. I'm making something. I'm building a webinar, I'm building a class session, I'm teaching a class session. And these require two different thought processes, and they really operate on two different tracks. And so what's very difficult for makers to stay in the moment is when the manager who's organizing calls and says, hey, what about this or what about that? Because maker time requires longer periods of uninterrupted deep work. And so Michelle is great at respecting that, and that's this little dance we have to do, is she has to understand what I need in terms of maker time to stay in the moment. And in return, what I try to do when I last minute her with things, which I often do, is I try to give her a heads up. Like the other day, I called her up in the beginning of the morning. I said, Michelle, I just want you to know, I want to reassure you. Those were the very words I used. All right. I didn't forget about my deadline today because I know you're on manager time, and I'm working on it, and you'll get it by. And of course, it was 30 minutes after I said she'd get it. But the fact of the matter is, I tried to respect her manager time, and she was respecting my maker time. So what's the whole point of all this? It's to stay in the moment. Interruptions, as we all know, distractions happen all the time. Not only are they annoying, not only do they detract from our productivity, but far more insidious is what happens below the surface. And we're coming back to this idea of control now. When Michelle calls me or emails me and asks me for something, I now feel out of control of my maker time. And that is an incredibly stressful feeling. And so those of you out there who are managers, and that may be most of you, one way for you to stay in the moment and to help your makers stay in the moment is to figure out a sense of timing and schedule where you can contact them about things without interrupting the maker time. And makers, of course, figure out when certain deadlines are due. And block out part of your day to have manager time. So again, this whole idea of the Ivy Lee 6 priorities, this tool of dividing manager and maker time, these are all designed to help you stay in the moment. So we have a few minutes left. I'm going to show you, let me say this, I did not intend to get through the entire presentation. It has been my experience, and I think Butch is out there listening. I know he knows that anytime we have, not we, just he and I, but when people have a meeting, when people have a conversation, the first topic on the agenda usually takes most of the time. And hopefully that's because it's important. So by design, I front-loaded what I thought were the top 3 tools and tried to go a little bit deeper on those, because I think you'll get most of your return on your investment from this webinar if you're able to practice these top 3 tools. Let me take 60 seconds and show you what else we have.
Mike, can I chime in just for a minute?
Of course you may.
So you're right. These are really deep topics, and you've given us so much to think about. So I'm going to give you something to think about. Perhaps there could be a part 2, because I have a feeling this is going to really generate a lot of discussion, a lot of thought, and I'm just throwing it out there that maybe you would want to do a deep dive into kind of the rest of the story at another point in time. But
yeah, absolutely,
you can think about that.
Absolutely. And so that's probably one way of saying it's time to go. Okay. All right, so let me leave you with this thought. When I was first introduced to Stoicism, these concepts seem pretty elementary. Like, okay, I already know that. Stay in the moment. Okay, that's what you're going to tell me. And as I've applied these over the last 2.5 years, I've realized, just as Jill had alluded, man, there's a lot of nuance to these, that they are not as simple and as obvious as they look. And the good news is they are a lot more powerful than they look on the surface as well. So if you're thinking, yeah, I've heard this stuff before, my encouragement is to start to practice it seriously, because you will find that there is so much more to these tools than meets the eye. And they can absolutely change your work life and your ability to advance your mission in the midst of hardship. I know they have for me, and I believe they will for you also. So yes, sign me up for a part 2.
Great.
And thank you very, very, very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Mike. That was really informative, and just to really appreciate the scaffolding, if you will, that you presented for Stoicism. Michelle, any last minute comments that need to be? Okay, so we're going to respect your time. I know you need to get back to work out there, but I will say stay tuned. We'll announce our August PowerBrew topic after we put a lot of pressure on Mike to see if he might be available. So great. Have a great day. Thanks for coming in. Bye-bye.